Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Highland Mystery. Oliver here. Lochdu is preparing for a respectable weekend of hymn singing, tea poured into thin cups, and the usual exchange of village opinion that travels faster than any motorcar from Strathbane. The kirk is busy, the manse is cluttered, and the notice board at street, Seds, is already carrying more authority than most policemen ever manage. It should be a harmless business. In Lochdu, that is often the moment when trouble begins. This evening, the village is expecting a visitor from the city. A woman who has come north with polished shoes, a hard sense of duty, and the alarming intention of improving everyone else. That sort of person can do a surprising amount of damage before ever raising her voice. Add to that one broken stove in Hamish Macbeth's cottage, one damp Highland night, one old photocopier producing strange results, and a village already half ready to take offence on principle, and the air begins to feel a touch too tight. There are no grand villains yet. No body lies waiting. Only a small mistake on a hymn sheet, a few sharp glances, and the sort of polite correction that can cut deeper than an insult. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you like what I'm doing here. Tell us where you are and what time it is in the comments. Now, turn off the lights and let's get started tonight. Chapter 1. The Choir, the Cold, and the Crusade. By late afternoon, a wet sleet was blowing in from the loch and striking the cottage windows in short, mean little bursts. Hamish Macbeth stood in the middle of his kitchen with his hands in his pockets and looked at the stove as if steady contempt might persuade it to work. It did not. There was a pan of water on a camping burner, the flame no bigger than a candle and twice as sulky. The air in the cottage felt damp enough to wear. Lugs lay by the door, sprawled like an old hearth rug, one eye open in case food should unexpectedly appear. Sonsie sat on the sill, black-striped and heavy-shouldered, her wild yellow eyes on the weather. "You'll no get sympathy from me," Hamish told the stove. Then, after a pause, he added, "Mind you, I'm no getting much heat from you either." Lugs thumped his tail once. Sonsie did not move. Hamish pulled on his waterproof and scarf. There was choir practice at Street Seds, and the minister had asked him to look in. That in itself meant very little. In Lochdu, a policeman was expected to appear at enough harmless events that his presence seemed accidental when something less harmless happened later. He bent to rub Lugs behind one floppy ear. "You stay put." Lugs got slowly to his feet at once, as if obedience had always been his intention but needed careful timing. "No," said Hamish. Lugs sat down again with a sigh large enough to suggest betrayal on a personal scale. Sonsie leapt from the sill, slipped between Hamish's boots, and was out through the half-open door before he could stop her. "Oh, fine," said Hamish. "You'll both do as you please, same as the rest of the village." The lane to the kirk ran black with rain. Beyond it, the loch showed only in patches through the mist, dark and flat as old slate. There were rowan branches clicking softly in the wind by the church wall. Light glowed from the kirk windows, yellow and mild against the weather, and Hamish felt that small easing he always felt at the sight of familiar places still in use. However much folk quarrelled in Lochdu, they still turned out for choir practice and funerals and tea. Inside, the church was warm with damp coats, candle wax, and the breath of people who had come in from the cold. Mrs. Wellington was setting a plate of seed cake on a table at the back. Mr. Wellington, who always looked as though he had misplaced either a sermon or a pair of spectacles, was turning pages at the front with growing distress. Miss Grant, the choir director, tapped her pencil against a music stand and tried to restore order among the altos. Nessie Curry and Jessie Curry had taken up a position halfway down the aisle from which they could monitor both piety and attendance. "I said from the start," declared Nessie, in the carrying tone she would have used for announcing a landslide, "that a moral renewal weekend means there has already been a lack of morals." "A lack of morals," echoed Jessie. "In a village," said Nessie darkly, "one must ask where it began." "Where it began," said Jessie. Mr. Patel, who had brought over a parcel of extra tea bags from the shop, smiled politely and pretended not to hear. Mrs. Patel, beside him, heard everything. Lugs came in behind Hamish and settled at once in the aisle, long and boneless, like something dropped there by a careless giant. Miss Grant looked at him, opened her mouth to object, and then thought better of it. Sonsie was nowhere visible, which usually meant she had found a strategic hiding place from which to despise the gathering in private. Hamish took off his cap and shook off the wet. "Evening." "Evening, Hamish," said Mr. Wellington with relief. "There's a visitor coming from Inverness. Well, from farther south originally. A lady of strong views." "That narrows it down none at all," said Hamish. Mrs. Wellington gave a small laugh and handed him a cup of tea. "Her name is Mrs. Lavinia Stripe. She is attached to some public decency campaign. She wrote 6 letters before she arrived." "7," said Mr. Wellington miserably. "One was copied to the presbytery." "That'll cheer ye," said Hamish. Mr. Wellington lowered his voice. "She means well." Nessie Curry, who had no business hearing him and yet always did, gave a thin sniff. "People who mean well," she said, "are often the busiest." "The busiest," repeated Jessie. Hamish drank his tea. It was hot and strong and tasted of tannin and relief. He took a slice of seed cake and stood near the back while the choir began to murmur through the first hymn. It was not a polished sound, but it was an earnest one, which in Lochdu counted for a good deal. Miss Grant stopped them after 2 lines. "No, no! The tenors are racing! We are praising, not pursuing!" There was rustling all through the pews as fresh sheets were handed round. Mr. Wellington frowned at his own page. Then Mrs. Wellington looked. Then Miss Grant looked. A snort escaped one of the sopranos. In another second half, the choir was trying not to laugh. Hamish held out his hand for a copy. The line should have read, "Guide me, O thou great Redeemer." Instead, in neat black type, it read, "Guide me, O thou great Reorderer." For a moment there was silence. Then a ripple of muffled laughter moved through the church like wind over grass. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Wellington. "It's the old copier," said Miss Grant. "It jammed twice." "It has always been a moral hazard," said Mrs. Wellington. Hamish looked again at the sheet. The mistake was absurd, but it had a faintly uncomfortable neatness to it, as if someone had improved the hymn for an audience that enjoyed arranging other people. Nessie Curry was not laughing. "It isn't not funny," she said. "Not funny," said Jessie. "It is irreverent." Irreverent. At that moment, the kirk door opened, and the cold came in with a woman who looked as if she had never once in her life been taken by surprise without resenting it. Mrs. Lavinia Stripe was tall, narrow, and tightly fastened into a dark coat with a fur collar that had seen better days and probably disapproved of them. Her hat sat low over iron-grey hair. She had a smooth city face, pale and dry, and eyes that moved quickly and judged at once. She carried a leather folder under one arm and a handbag that might have contained either leaflets or legal action. Mr. Wellington hurried forward. "Mrs. Stripe, welcome to Street Seds." She gave him 2 fingers' worth of a handshake. "Reverend Wellington, I trust arrangements have been made. We are just at practice." So I heard. Here gaze had fallen on the plate of seed cake, on lugs in the aisle, on the damp patch under Archie McLean's boots, and at last on the hymn sheet in Miss Grant's hand. "What is that?" she asked. Miss Grant, who could manage sharpness when she chose, said, "A printing error." Mrs. Stripe took the paper and read the line. Her mouth did not exactly tighten. It had arrived that way. "How revealing," she said. There was a little shift in the room. Small, but general. Hamish had seen it often enough. One person enters and the rest begin silently deciding which side of themselves to show. "It gave us a laugh," said Mrs. Wellington. "Errors reveal character," said Mrs. Stripe. "As do jokes, particularly in religious matters." No one answered that. Even the Curry sisters seemed to feel that competition had arrived. Hamish stepped forward with a sort of mild expression that made strangers think him slower than he was. "I'm the local constable, Hamish Macbeth." "Indeed." Her eyes took in his height, his red hair, his weathered coat, and came to a conclusion he could nearly hear. "Then perhaps you can help preserve proper standards while I am here." "We do our best," said Hamish. "I am sure," she said, in a tone which suggested she was sure of the opposite. She turned briskly to Mr. Wellington. "I shall need the Parish Hall booking book, copies of recent notices, details of all social events attached to the church, and the list of those responsible for refreshments. I have seen cases where irregularity begins in the kitchen and spreads rapidly. Mrs. Wellington stared at her. In the kitchen? In communities, said Mrs. Stripe. Decline often disguises itself as hospitality, Archie McLean muttered. That'll be a comfort to the fish supper trade. Hamish hid a smile. Mrs. Stripe continued. I am also told there is a public house quiz night, which overlaps with evening devotions. It overlaps with nothing, said Miss Grant. People attend whichever they like. Precisely, said Mrs. Stripe. Her eye fell on one of the younger women in the back pew, who had come in from work, still wearing trousers. And perhaps, she said, certain standards of dress might be gently restored. At that, the room cooled in a way the weather had not managed. Nessie Curry drew herself up, delighted to find moral weather she had not personally manufactured. I have often said, she began. Often said, Jessie chimed in, but Mrs. Stripe had already moved on. She set her folder down on the front pew and began taking out papers with the efficiency of a clerk preparing for siege. Hamish drifted nearer and caught sight of neat-typed headings, dates, and the word conduct in capitals. There was also a list of bookings for the hall, marked in red pencil. Whist drive, youth supper, charity lunch, quiz fundraiser at the pub. Anything with gravy, thought Hamish, seemed doomed. Mr. Wellington gave him a helpless glance. Hamish gave back the smallest shrug. It meant, Not here, not yet, and let us no make it worse. Then Mrs. Stripe said, I understand Detective Chief Inspector Blair occasionally supervises matters in this district. The name hit Hamish like sleet down the back of the neck. He kept his face mild, but his jaw set. He supervises from Strathbane, said Hamish. Good. A senior officer may prove useful if local arrangements have become too relaxed. There were several things Hamish might have said to that. He said none of them. Instead, he smiled in the loose, easy way that made people underestimate him. Lochdu manages to be itself, Mrs. Stripe. She looked at him for a moment. That, she said, is exactly what concerns me. From somewhere behind the hymn books came a low, furious hiss. Sonsie had revealed herself at last, 2 yellow eyes and a strip of striped fur visible between the salters. Lugs raised his head, thumped his tail once, and slept again. Mrs. Stripe stared at the cat. You have a wild creature in the church. She comes and goes, said Hamish. How improper! Aye, said Hamish. That's one word for it. Choir practice resumed in a thin, uncertain way, but the room had altered. People sang while watching one another over their sheets. Mrs. Stripe sat with her folder on her lap and made notes. The Curry sisters whispered like dry leaves. Mr. Patel slipped quietly out, which meant the shop would know everything before the final amen. Mrs. Wellington cut smaller slices of cake than before, perhaps from principle. Hamish stood near the back and listened to the hymn rise, falter, and gather again. Outside, the sleet went on needling at the glass. Inside, the paper in his hand crackled softly when he folded it. He looked once more at the printed line. Guide me, O thou great reorderer. It had seemed comic a few minutes ago. Now it looked less like a joke than a warning, and when Mrs. Stripe asked, at the close, for a private word about the church records and the hall accounts, the warmth went out of the evening altogether. Chapter 2. A quiet word at the manse. By the time choir practice broke up, the sleet had thickened into a fine freezing rain that silvered the church path and made every step uncertain. The loch lay somewhere beyond the kirk wall, hidden in mist. The bell rope stirred faintly in the draught from the open door, and Hamish stood for a moment under the porch and watched the villagers separate into little islands of opinion. Mrs. Lavinia Stripe had not made many friends in under an hour, which, Hamish thought, was brisk work even for a stranger. Nessie Curry drew her coat tight about her. A woman does not come all this way with papers unless she means trouble. Means trouble, said Jessie. Or reform, said Mrs. Wellington, who had come out behind them with an empty cake plate. Which is often the same thing, said Nessie. Mr. Patel, on his way back to the shop, gave Hamish a slight smile. There will be much talk tonight. There usually is, said Hamish. Aye, said Mr. Patel. "But this time it will be about receipts." That made Hamish look at him more sharply. "Receipts?" Mr. Patel lifted one shoulder. "Mrs. Stripe asked me, this afternoon, whether church fundraising money passed through the parish account or separately through the hall committee. I told her I only sell the biscuits." Then he went off into the rain, sensible enough not to add to the matter in public. Hamish turned that over in his mind. Money had a way of making even small villages cleverer and sillier than usual. It could sharpen envy, loosen tongues, and send perfectly respectable people into corners where they began to lie. Lugs pushed his wet nose against Hamish's hand. Sonsie appeared along the low wall, striped back arched against the damp, and then slipped away toward the manse garden as if she had private business of her own. Inside the church, Mrs. Stripe was still speaking to Mr. Wellington in the clipped, controlled voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed by committees. Miss Grant was stacking hymn books with unnecessary force. Archie McLean had taken refuge by the vestry door and was muttering to himself about Southerners and the decline of common decency. Hamish wandered in as if he had nowhere in particular to be. Mrs. Stripe was saying, "I should prefer to review the hall lettings for the last 6 months. In villages such as these, one often finds a regrettable blurring of boundaries between charitable purpose and social indulgence." Mr. Wellington gave a small cough. "I am sure all is in order." "Yes," said Mrs. Stripe. "That is what people generally say when asked." Hamish let his expression go loose and mild. "Can I be helping with anything?" Mrs. Stripe turned to him. "Only by discouraging interference." "Aye, well," said Hamish, "there's enough of that in Lochdu already." For the first time, something like irritation showed plainly on her face. "I am not here to be liked, Constable Macbeth." "I dare say you've made a fine start, then." Mr. Wellington made a distressed movement, but to Hamish's surprise, Mrs. Stripe did not take open offence. She merely studied him, as if deciding whether he was a fool or only disguised as wise. "The churchwarden," she said at last. "I was told he would be here." "He's about," said Hamish. As if summoned by the word, Angus MacNab came in from the side door carrying a ring of keys and the sort of fixed smile men use when they want to appear useful without inviting questions. He was a neat man. Too neat for Lochdu on a freezing wet night. His dark coat was well brushed. His hair was smoothed back. Even his shoes had a city polish to them, though there was mud on everyone else's boots. Hamish noticed, too, the quick glance Angus gave Mrs. Stripe's leather folder before he looked away again. "Mrs. Stripe," said Angus, "you wished to see me." "I did." Her tone changed. It was no friendlier, but it grew more purposeful. "And I shall need the treasurer as well." "There are discrepancies I want explained." Mr. Wellington blinked. "Discrepancies?" "In booking fees, repair costs, and certain charitable collections." She tapped the folder. "I do not discuss such matters loosely. I prefer facts." Angus laughed then, but not well. "I dare say there's some simple muddle. We've old systems here." "So I see," said Mrs. Stripe. "Old systems, old excuses." Hamish kept his face blank, though the words had pricked his attention. Angus was smiling too much. Mr. Wellington looked bewildered, and the folder under Mrs. Stripe's hand had a label pasted neatly to the front. Evidence. Not allegations. Not notes. Evidence. The rain rattled suddenly against the window. Somebody had left the vestry door ajar, and the draught sent one of the loose hymn sheets skating across the flagstones. Lugs lifted his head but declined to pursue it. Sonsie reappeared in the doorway, dripping slightly, and regarding the room with fierce yellow suspicion. Mrs. Wellington bent to rescue the sheet. "This weather will be the death of my joints." "The weather," said Nessie Curry from the back, who had managed not to go home after all, "is no worse than a city woman with a mission." "With a mission," echoed Jessie. "Ladies," said Mr. Wellington weakly. Mrs. Stripe ignored them. "I want a private meeting after evening prayers tomorrow." "With whom?" asked Angus. "With those concerned." She looked at Mr. Wellington. "You?" "Certainly, Mr. MacNab, the parish treasurer. No witnesses, no village theatrics." At that, Hamish saw Angus's hand tighten on the keys. "There's no need to talk like that," Angus said. "This is a church. No, a law court." "Quite," said Mrs. Stripe. "Which is why I am trying to avoid scandal before I determine whether it is necessary." Mr. Wellington seemed on the verge of asking for tea, prayer, or mercy. In the end, he settled for saying, "Perhaps we might continue this in the Manse kitchen." "That would be more suitable," said Mrs. Stripe. Hamish followed at a polite distance as the little party crossed the wet path to the manse. The kitchen there was bright and overheated, with a kettle singing on the hob and an assortment of parish circulars spread across the scrubbed table. It smelled of tea leaves, furniture polish, and overboiled cabbage from some earlier meal. Whatever else could be said of manse life, it was warmer than Hamish's cottage. That thought made him feel a flicker of resentment on behalf of his stove. Mrs. Wellington busied herself with cups. Angus stood by the dresser, still wearing that polished look, though there was sweat beginning at his temple. Mrs. Stripe laid her folder on the table and kept one hand on it as if she feared the room might try to steal it. Hamish stayed near the door. "Don't mind me," he said. "I was only seeing everyone safe over the path." "A noble service," said Mrs. Stripe. "It's an icy one." Mrs. Wellington handed him a mug anyway, which he accepted gratefully. The tea was strong enough to stand a spoon in. Better this than the thin brown wash they served in Strathbane. Better this, too, than the lukewarm water he would have managed at home. Mr. Wellington sat down with the look of a man entering dental treatment. "What exactly is the concern?" Mrs. Stripe opened the folder and took out several sheets, clipped together with painful neatness. Hall rental payments recorded at one figure and banked at another. Repairs invoiced twice under slightly different descriptions. Charity monies assigned to maintenance without a recorded vote. Small sums, individually. Taken together, not small at all, Angus said at once. "There'll be explanations." "I hope so," said Mrs. Stripe. "Because at present it looks very much like carelessness, and carelessness with church funds soon becomes something uglier." Hamish sipped his tea and watched. Mrs. Stripe's manner was chilly, but she was not wrong to press. Angus gave the appearance of a man who wanted to reach across the table and shut the folder with his own hand. Mr. Wellington looked as if he would rather resign from religion entirely. "The treasurer has all the books," Angus said. "And where is the treasurer now?" asked Mrs. Stripe. "At home," said Mr. Wellington. "He was not at practice." "Then ask him to attend tomorrow evening," said Mrs. Stripe. "After prayers. Here, or in the vestry if you prefer. Quietly. I shall have no audience. No witnesses, no village theatrics," Angus repeated, trying for a smile. She looked at him. "Exactly." There was a short silence. The kettle hissed gently on the hob. Outside, the rain ran under the window ledge in a cold little stream. Hamish became aware of Sonsie slipping in at the back door and taking up a position under the table, where only her eyes showed. Lugs, after some argument with his bones, settled near the range and gave a deep sigh of comfort. Hamish thought how quickly creatures identified warmth, and how slowly people did. Mrs. Wellington put a plate of scones on the table. "They are from the hotel. Priscilla sent them over." "Thank God for that," said Mr. Wellington, before he could stop himself. His wife gave him a look of injured dignity. Hamish hid a smile in his mug. Tomall Castle Hotel might be expensive and over-furnished, but at least its kitchen knew what a scone ought to be. He took one and spread it with butter, while pretending no particular interest in the papers on the table. He had seen enough. Money. Hall rentals. Repairs. Charity funds. A private meeting set for after prayers, with tempers already beginning to fray. And Angus MacNab, polished as a solicitor in a place where most men still smelled of wet wool and peat smoke, was far too tense for innocence. At last, Hamish put down his mug. "I'll away then," Mrs. Stripe said. "Constable Macbeth," he paused, "if there is any attempt to interfere with my inquiries, I shall report it at once." "Aye," said Hamish. "Do that." He went out into the cold before his temper could improve or worsen. The path back to the kirk gleamed with frost under the rain. Behind him the manse windows shone yellow through the mist, warm and close and full of paper. Ahead lay his cottage, with its dead stove, its damp walls, and two beasts who would expect supper whether justice was done or not. By the time he reached the road, he had the unpleasant feeling that Lochdu had stopped laughing at the hymn sheet and started listening for what would come after it. Chapter 3. The Body Before the Benediction. Morning came mean and pale. A weak winter light lay over Lochdu, as if spread too thin, and the frost under the rain had turned the church path into a strip of treachery. Hamish, who had slept badly in a damp bed under a sullen roof, woke to find the cottage colder than good sense. The stove remained dead. He stood in his socks on the worn rug, and looked at it with the weary dislike one reserves for old enemies. Lugs lay by the door, sprawled and magnificent in uselessness. Sonsie had taken the better place by the window and watched the faint paling of the loch through the mist. Hamish put the kettle on the camping burner and waited while it considered whether to do its duty. The tea came grudgingly. He broke off a piece of bread, gave some to Lugs, and opened a tin of sardines for Sonsie, who appeared from the sill at once with the grave air of an animal answering a summons from necessity, not affection. "You've both a warmer life than me," Hamish told them. Lugs wagged. Sonsie ate. There was no point lingering. Mrs. Lavinia Stripe had insisted on a private meeting after evening prayers, and Hamish had gone to bed with the uncomfortable sense that several people in Lochdu would have slept less than he did. A village could carry tension the way a wire carried frost. Quietly, but through every part of it, he set out early. The road to the kirk ran under low cloud. Rain clung to the grass in silver beads. The hills beyond the loch were half hidden, and the water itself showed now and then through the mist, dark and patient. Smoke from a few chimneys lay flat in the air. It was the sort of morning on which any bad news would travel faster because people were indoors to pass it on. He had nearly reached the church gate when he saw Mrs. Wellington hurrying toward him from the manse, one hand at her throat, her face drained of colour. "Hamish." Something in her voice stopped him at once. "What is it?" "It's in the kirk." "No, the vestry." "Oh, dear God." She took a breath that shivered. "It's that woman, Mrs. Stripe. I went to open up, and she's there." Hamish went past her without another word. The kirk door stood ajar. Inside, the air had the cold, stale stillness of a building shut overnight. Light filtered through the stained glass in a weak wash of blue and amber. A hymn board leaned crookedly against the wall. One of the prayer books had fallen open on a pew. Lugs padded in behind Hamish and stopped, ears up, reading the room in the old dog's simple way. Sonsie slipped in after, low to the ground, and vanished behind the shelf where spare hymn sheets were kept. Hamish crossed the nave and pushed open the vestry door. The narrow stair to the side room rose at an awkward angle from the far end, steep and mean, carpeted with a runner that had seen better decades. Mrs. Lavinia Stripe lay at the bottom of it. There was nothing theatrical in death. That was what struck Hamish first. No violence shouted from the scene, only the unnatural stillness of a woman who had arrived in Lochdu full of hard purpose, and now seemed reduced to weight, cloth, and silence. One arm was bent under her. Her hat had come off and lay on the flagstones near the wall. Her leather folder was nowhere to be seen. Hamish stood a moment, not from indecision but from the old trained instinct of letting a place speak before one disturbed it. Mrs. Wellington hovered in the doorway behind him. "Is she?" "Yes," said Hamish quietly. He went forward with care. The stair-runner was slightly skewed near the bottom, then tugged back into place so roughly that the edge did not sit square against the stone. A man in a hurry might have thought it looked neat enough. Hamish did not. He crouched. Mrs. Stripe's coat was buttoned to the neck. One glove was missing. In the outer pocket of her coat there was the torn corner of a paper sheet, caught just inside as if stuffed there or gripped in her hand before falling. Hamish eased it free. It was a familiar sort of paper, cheap church stock, the same distinctive type as the hymn sheets from the night before. Only a corner, but enough for him to see part of the line. Riet Reordera. He slid it back into the pocket where he had found it. Behind him, Mrs. Wellington gave a small sound of distress. She came for evening prayers. Then she said she needed to speak privately. My husband thought she had gone back to the hotel. "Oh, Hamish, what are we to do?" "Fetch Dr. Brodie," said Hamish, "and stay by the front door. Let no one wander in if ye can help it." She nodded and went, one hand pressed still to her breast. Hamish stood and looked again at the stairs. It might be called an accident by anyone determined to keep life simple. A slip, a fall, a head striking stone. But Mrs. Stripe had not looked like a woman who went anywhere carelessly, and the runner had no business lying that way unless someone had caught it, dragged it, or tried to set it right afterwards. He turned at a faint rustle. Sonsie had emerged from the hymn books, her wild yellow eyes fixed on the stair, fur slightly raised along her back. She gave a short hiss into the silence, and then withdrew again. "Noted," Hamish murmured. Within minutes, the kirk filled with the small sounds that always follow death in a village. Doors opening too fast, feet crossing stone, lowered voices pretending not to be eager, and the first ripple of news passing beyond the walls. Archie McLean appeared at the entrance and removed his cap. Mr. Patel came to the porch but did not step inside. Nessie Curry and Jessie Curry materialized, as such women always did, at precisely the point where grief and information met. "I said she brought trouble," declared Nessie in a whisper that carried from one end of the kirk to the other. "Brought trouble?" said Jessie. "And now look. Now look." Hamish went to the doorway before they could advance farther. "Out." Nessie drew herself up. "We are only showing Christian concern." "Aye, and ye can show it from outside." Dr. Brodie arrived briskly, bag in hand, his kind face grave but steady. Angela Brodie was with him, breathless in her coat and hat, clearly having come despite the hour and the cold, because there are some things kindness does before sense catches up. Dr. Brodie gave Hamish one quick glance and went in. Angela touched Hamish's sleeve. "Have you had any breakfast?" "Tea." "That is not breakfast." "It's what there was. I'll send something down." He almost smiled. Even standing at a kirk door with death on the stones, Angela Brodie would find room to worry over a man's stomach. It was one of the things that held Lochdu together when it might otherwise fly apart. Soon after, the peace was broken in full by the arrival of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He came into the kirk in a gust of damp air, cigarette already between his fingers despite the setting, his heavy face red from the drive, and his expression one of injured authority. He smelled of stale smoke, wet wool, and the sort of impatience that assumed itself superior. "What in hell's name have you got now?" he barked, then saw the body, and stopped only long enough to throw the cigarette onto the path. "God save us. In a church as well. Bloody busybodies." Hamish's mouth tightened. Blair swung on him at once. "Well? Was she pushed? Was she drunk? Did none of you fools think to keep an eye on her?" "She's no one of mine to keep penned," said Hamish. Blair stared around the kirk as if the building itself had personally offended him. "Accidents," he said loudly. "It's likely an accident. Slipped on the stair in the dark. These old places are death traps." Dr. Brodie came out of the vestry, removing his glasses. "She is dead," he said. "That much is clear." Blair gave an impatient gesture. Yes, thank you, Doctor. We have all observed the obvious." Angela Brodie's face cooled. Blair lowered his voice only a fraction when he realized the matter might interest newspapers. "Any signs of struggle?" "None plain," said Hamish. "But the stair-runner's been shifted. And there's paper in her pocket from the hymn sheets." Blair snorted. "A churchwoman carrying church paper. Remarkable deduction, Macbeth." Hamish said nothing. When he was angry, his Highland voice sometimes went soft and sibilant, and it was better not to let that happen too soon. Blair blundered past him into the vestry, and immediately began touching things he ought not to touch, then roaring questions before anyone had gathered enough facts to answer them. By then the news had broken loose. Outside, the villagers had thickened into a waiting cluster under umbrellas and caps. Mrs. Wellington stood among them like someone trying to hold back a tide with good breeding alone. Nessie Curry had already arranged her face into tragic importance. Jessie mirrored it half a beat later. Hamish watched them all, and felt the village change shape around the death. Suspicion sharpened, curiosity put on mourning clothes. Whatever Mrs. Stripe had come to expose, her silence would make it worse before it made it clearer. Then Blair's voice crashed out from the vestry. "Macbeth! Get in here!" Hamish turned back toward the narrow stair and the cold little room beyond it, where the light was weak and the shifted runner lay like a sentence badly corrected. And he had the first clear thought that this was no accident at all. Chapter 4. Canteen food and better bread. Blair insisted on taking charge in the worst possible way, which was his habit. By 11:30, Hamish found himself in Strathbane Police Station Canteen, with a plate of something pale and exhausted in front of him, while Blair talked as though the case had already been solved and merely awaited official admiration. The canteen smelled of old grease, wet uniforms, and overboiled vegetables. Rain filmed the windows. Beyond them, Strathbane lay under a low sky the colour of dishwater. Hamish sat with his long legs tucked awkwardly under the table and looked down at a sausage of doubtful parentage, mashed potatoes with the texture of wall filler, and peas that had surrendered all hope. Blair, by contrast, was eating with noisy confidence. Crumbs lodged in his moustache. He stabbed the air with his fork, as if every point he made required physical assault. "It's simple," he said. "These church folk are always at each other. One of them lost his temper, shoved the woman, and that's that. We'll have it wrapped up by lunch and entered up by tea." Hamish cut into the sausage and regretted it at once. "Are ye?" "Yes, aye." Blair leaned back, flushed and smug. "The minister's the obvious one. Timid men are often the worst. All that piety, all that repression, and then snap happens all the time." "You know many ministers who snap on stairs." Blair gave him a look of thick contempt. "Don't start your Highland nonsense with me, Macbeth." The woman came north to meddle. She cornered church people over money, conduct, and God knows what else. She fell. End of story. Except for the shifted runner. A rug on old stairs in a damp kirk. It moved. And the torn paper in her pocket. A church woman carrying church paper, said Blair, mimicking him in a rough sing-song. "You've said that already. If there's one thing I cannot stand, it's a man trying to make a mystery where there's only provincial hysteria." Hamish looked at him mildly. He had learned over the years that Blair's temper often did useful work if left to run. The man talked too much when he felt grand, and when he felt clever, he became blind. "So you've settled on the minister?" Hamish asked. "For now. What about the churchwarden?" Blair snorted. "That peacock? Too smooth, maybe, but not the type. Men like that steal quietly and never shove unless they're cornered." That, Hamish thought, was not nearly as stupid as most of Blair's remarks, though it came out wrapped in insult and gravy. Blair shoveled more potato into his mouth. "There was that girl with a photocopier as well. What's her name?" "Maisie." "Yes. Village lass. Eager to please. Probably soft in the head. Those are the ones who panic." Hamish's voice went softer. "She's no more soft in the head than you are." Blair put down his fork. "What was that?" "I said she was upset." Blair glared at him. Hamish let his face settle into amiable vacancy. For a moment it seemed Blair might begin roaring properly. Then a sergeant came over with more tea, and Blair contented himself with swallowing his irritation along with the dregs in his cup. "I'll speak to the minister again," he said. "Then to the treasurer. You can go back to Lochdu and keep the villagers from turning it into a circus. And if you get ideas about interfering, Macbeth, remember this. Inverness is still discussing your future." Hamish knew what that meant. Promotion, removal, exile dressed as advancement. He felt the old inward resistance to it, as physical as a man leaning against a door. "I'll bear it in mind," he said. Blair wiped his mouth with a paper napkin and stood up. "Do that. I'll solve it. You can admire me afterwards." Hamish watched him lumber off through the canteen, large and certain and wrong in ways that would likely prove dangerous to someone else before they inconvenienced him. He pushed away the plate. He had eaten enough to know it would not improve. On the station wall, a clock ticked with bureaucratic confidence. Outside, rain slid down the glass in thin grey threads. Hamish felt suddenly starved for anything honest. Real bread, clean air, and a room where nobody shouted. By the time he was back in Lochdu, the weather had changed again. The rain had eased to a sharp, damp mist drifting over the loch. The hills rose and vanished by turns like thoughts one could not quite keep. The village looked huddled into itself, smoke from chimneys flattening low. News of the death had got everywhere. You could feel it in the way doors opened quickly, and then only part way, in the way faces paused half a second longer at windows. At Patel's general store, the queue was out of proportion to necessity, which meant it was not groceries people wanted. Mr. Patel stood behind the counter with his usual patient smile, moving tins and bread loaves while taking in everything. Mrs. Patel wrapped rashers of bacon with an efficiency that suggested gossip might be tolerated but would not interrupt work. Nessie and Jessie Curry stood near the biscuit shelf in matching coats, as solemn as ravens at a christening. "I am saying," Nessie announced to the room at large, "that the woman was doomed the moment she began asking about collections." "About collections," echoed Jessie. "And hall suppers. Hall suppers. No decent thing ever came from account books." "Account books." Mr. Patel handed a customer her change. "In that case," he said mildly, "I hope you never balance your gas bill." There was a small laugh. Even Nessie could not condemn arithmetic in a shop. Hamish bought sausage, bread, tea, and a packet of biscuits he did not need. That gave him the right to linger. It also gave Mr. Patel the chance to pass over information without appearing to. "Mrs. Wellington was in earlier," he said. "She said the dead lady had appointments written in her notebook. 3 of them." Hamish looked up. "With who?" "The minister, Mr. McNab, and the treasurer. Separate times, same evening." Nessie swung round at once. "There you are. If a woman arranges 3 secret meetings in a kirk, she cannot expect to leave with universal affection." "Universal affection," said Jessie. "She had a manner." "A manner? What sort of manner?" asked Hamish. "The sort," said Nessie, drawing herself up, "that says she would inspect your soul and your teapot in the same glance." "In the same glance," said Jessie. That, thought Hamish, was likely true enough. He left the shop with the small bag under his arm and the curry verdict ringing behind him like badly struck bells. Gossip, once released, travelled through Lochdu faster than official instruction and far more accurately in its emotional details. Facts might lag. Resentment never did. At the police station he found Lugs waiting by the steps, stretched out in the damp as though stone were a sensible bed for a dog. At the sight of the bag, he rose in a loose, hopeful curve and trotted after Hamish inside. I know," said Hamish. "You'd think I'd been away to war." The station kettle made a sound like a dying insect. Hamish ignored it. He gave Lugs a piece of sausage and sat at the desk with his notebook open. 3 meetings. The minister. Angus MacNab, the parish treasurer, each one private. Each one with reason to fear what Lavinia Stripe had come north carrying in that folder marked evidence. He wrote their names down in a neat line and stared at them while Lugs chewed with profound concentration. Outside, the mist thickened over the loch, blurring the village into patches of light and dark. Then the back flap rattled, and Sonsie came in through the cat door with the self-satisfied air of a creature returning from successful violence. She landed lightly on the floorboards, shook rain from her coat, and fixed Hamish with her wild yellow stare. He caught at once the faint smell of candle wax on her fur. "Well, where have you been?" Sonsie did not answer, being a cat, but she leapt onto the chair by the stove and began washing one paw with fierce attention. Lugs looked up, swallowed, and resumed chewing. Hamish tore off another piece of sausage and gave it to the dog. He was still hungry himself, and suddenly tired of pretending he was not. The memory of the Strathbane canteen sat in his stomach like a personal insult. He locked the station and went up to Tommel Castle Hotel by the service entrance, where the kitchen sent out better smells than most places managed on feast days. In the warmth inside, pans rattled, stock simmered, and someone was baking fresh bread. A young kitchen maid who knew him grinned and produced a bowl of soup, a heel of still warm loaf, and a wedge of cheese without being asked too many questions. "Mrs. Halberton Smythe says if you're taking that, you're to sit down like a human being and not bolt it on the road." Hamish looked round and saw Priscilla in the doorway, elegant as ever, cool and composed in a dark green sweater, one eyebrow slightly raised. "You look half frozen," she said. "I'm grand. You are string and weather. Sit." He sat. The soup was rich and hot. The bread had a real crust. The cheese tasted of milk instead of regret. Hamish ate in silence at first, feeling the warmth return to him in sensible layers. It was one of the comforts of Priscilla that she never fussed sentimentally. She merely arranged matters and expected the world to benefit. "What has Blair done?" she asked, after a while. "Eaten his way to a theory." "Poor theory?" "Poor lunch." "Worse theory." She almost smiled. Then you had better solve it before he arrests the wrong person and calls it efficiency. That was my thought. And? 3 people had private meetings set with Mrs. Stripe, said Hamish. Minister, churchwarden, treasurer. Each says she only wanted to talk. Priscilla leaned against the dresser, watching him. And which of them lies best? Angus MacNab smiles too much. That is often a sign, she said, of either guilt or ambition. With Angus it could be both. Priscilla's mouth sharpened slightly. Then do try to move faster than Blair. Hamish finished the last of the bread and stood up. I was planning to. On his way back down through the village, the loch gave off a cold, dim light under the mist. Somewhere a door shut quickly. Somewhere else a voice dropped as he passed. Lochdu was thinking now, and not kindly. Back in the station, Sonsie was asleep in his chair as if she owned it, which she nearly did. Lugs had curled by the wall, full of sausage and principles. Hamish looked again at the 3 names in his notebook. One of them had met Lavinia Stripe after prayers. One of them had lied. And somewhere between a hymn sheet, a folder of accounts, and a badly adjusted stair-runner, the shape of the truth was beginning to show. Chapter 5. Blair's wrath finds a target. By the following afternoon the weather had settled into a bitter indecision between sleet and rain, the sort of Highland damp that crept into cuffs and tempers alike. The loch was a sheet of pewter under the mist. Smoke hung low over Lochdu, and every conversation in the village seemed to begin with the words, "I am not saying," but, before proceeding to say a great deal. Hamish had spent the morning moving quietly from one small source of information to another. In Lochdu, a case was never solved by marching about with a notebook and a superior manner. It was solved by letting people believe they were merely passing the time. A remark over tea, a complaint by the shop counter, a whisper on the church path, these were worth more than most official interviews. And at present, they were all circling round one name. Messie. She was a young volunteer who helped at street seds with notices, flowers, jumble sales, and anything else that needed doing without fuss or payment. She had fair hair, a pink, anxious face, and the habit of looking guilty whenever anyone older addressed her suddenly, whether she had done anything or not. In short, thought Hamish, she was exactly the sort Blair would pounce on because she looked as if she might cry. He found her first in the parish hall, stacking cups after a church tea that had gone mostly uneaten because half the village was too busy discussing murder to enjoy seed cake. The room smelled of damp coats, weak tea, and furniture polish. Folding chairs stood about in accusatory little rows. Miss Grant, the choir director, was by the hatch, washing spoons with the force of a woman polishing up her opinions. Maisie started when Hamish came in. "Oh." "Constable Macbeth." "Aye, and if ye call me that in Lochdu, folk will think I'm a stranger." That made her smile a little, though only for a moment. Miss Grant turned from the sink. "If you have come to ask whether I murdered that woman, I did not. Though I was tempted to throttle her when she criticised the altos. That narrows the field none," said Hamish. Miss Grant sniffed. She criticised everybody. She said my arrangements encouraged levity. "Do they?" "Occasionally." Hamish leaned against the hatch and let his long body adopt its slackest, least threatening shape. "I was wondering about the hymn sheets." Maisie's hands, still on the stack of cups, tightened at once. Miss Grant said sharply, "The poor girl has been worried sick over that foolish printing mistake." "I'm no accusing her." "No," said Miss Grant, "but others will." That was true enough. Lochdu could take up a harmless error and nurse it until it began to resemble moral collapse. Maisie said in a low voice, "I printed them." Hamish waited. "The regular batch, I mean. For choir. I typed it all properly, checked it, and ran them off. There was no mistake in my file." She looked up at him with frightened honesty. "I know that sounds like a thing someone would say, but there wasn't." "Then what happened?" The copier jammed. Miss Grant made a disgusted sound. "It always jams." "Not like that," said Maisie. "It chewed the paper and made a dreadful whining noise." "I thought it had broken for good." "Who was with ye?" asked Hamish. Maisie hesitated. That was enough to tell him the answer mattered. "Mr. MacNab came in," she said at last. "He said I was doing it wrong and he'd have a look. He fiddled about with the tray and the side panel and told me to fetch more paper from the cupboard." How long was ye gone? Only a minute. Maybe 2. Miss Grant stopped washing spoons. And you never mentioned that before. No one asked, said Maisie miserably. Hamish filed the detail away, not because it proved anything yet, but because small omissions often mattered more than dramatic declarations. The old copier jammed. Angus McNab handled it. After that, the special batch contained the word reorderer. Before he could ask another question, the parish hall door banged open, and Blair came in trailing wet air, stale tobacco, and ill temper. He looked larger indoors than outdoors, as if walls gave his bluster something to bounce off. Behind him came one of the Strathbane men with a notebook, and the expression of a clerk preparing for weather. "There you are," roared Blair. "I've been looking for the little printer." Maisie went white. Hamish straightened. "She's no runaway." Blair ignored him and jabbed a finger toward Maisie. "You. Sit down." Maisie sat at once, more from shock than obedience. Miss Grant drew herself up. "This is the parish hall, not a police cell." Blair gave her a quick, piggy-eyed glance. "And you are?" "The choir director." "Then direct your choir and leave police work to men." Miss Grant flushed so hard Hamish thought for one moment she might throw a spoon at him. Hamish said mildly, "Careful, Blair. You'll have the sopranos declaring war." Blair swung round. "This lass printed the sheet that lured the dead woman into the vestry, did she not?" "We don't know that," said Hamish. "We know enough. She printed rubbish." "The dead woman had that rubbish in her pocket. It's called progress." "It's called guessing," said Hamish. Blair leaned over Maisie. "Did you alter the sheet? Did you send for Mrs. Stripe? Did she threaten you over some little village scandal and then you panicked?" Maisie's lips trembled. No, I never." Miss Grant moved to her side at once. "This is outrageous." "What is outrageous," said Blair, "is the number of idiots I have to deal with in one day." Hamish felt the old anger come up in him, quiet and cold. When that happened, his voice went softer, the Highland sibilants sharpening like sleet on glass. "She printed the ordinary batch," he said. "That's all." Blair heard the change and turned. "What was that?" Hamish took one step nearer. "I said she printed the ordinary batch." The copier jammed. Mr. McNab helped. After that there was another set. For a moment the room stilled. Miss Grant looked from Hamish to Maisie. "Another set?" Maisie nodded miserably. "Only a few. The machine was spitting them crooked, and Mr. McNab said he'd make do. He said no one would mind for practice." Blair stared. "Why in hell did you not mention this earlier?" "I was frightened," Maisie whispered. "And everybody was looking at me." There it was. The real strength of gossip in a place like Lochdu. It did not merely spread facts. It selected a face to wear them. From outside in the passage came the unmistakable voice of Nessie Curry. "I said from the start it would be the weak one." "The weak one?" echoed Jessie. Hamish shut his eyes briefly. They had no business being there, and every business being there. Blair barked toward the door. "Get those 2 harridans out!" Nessie appeared at once, as if summoned by insult. "Harridans? I have never in my life." "In your life," said Jessie, "been so spoken to in a church building." "In a church building." "This is the hall," said Miss Grant coldly. "That makes it worse," said Nessie. Mr. Patel, who seemed to have appeared from nowhere carrying a tray of tea, set it down with quiet dignity. "Perhaps everyone would think more clearly with a hot drink." That punctured the scene just enough to keep it from turning ugly. Even Blair, confronted by a tray and the calm gaze of Mr. Patel, seemed uncertain whether to roar or drink. He chose both. Hamish handed a cup to Maisie. "Here, steady on." She took it in both hands. Blair began again, though less confidently. "So McNab touched the machine." "That means what?" "That it jammed while she was printing," said Hamish. "And that the misprint was no in her original file." Miss Grant said at once, "I knew it. She would never meddle with a hymn." Maisie burst into tears at that, less from relief than from sheer exhausted strain. Miss Grant put an arm round her shoulders with the stiff kindness of a woman not practised in comfort, but willing to provide it. Blair gulped tea, burned his tongue, swore, and then tried to recover authority. Well, the churchwarden can answer for himself. Meanwhile, this girl stays available for questioning. She was staying anyway, said Hamish. It's no Monte Carlo. Blair glared. You are trying my patience, Macbeth. A short occupation. The Strathbane constable looked down very hard at his notebook. When Blair finally lumbered out again, trailing outrage and tea stains, the hall seemed to breathe. Rain tapped at the high windows. Somewhere in the kitchen a tap dripped with the stubbornness of old plumbing. Lugs, who had slipped in unnoticed during the uproar, was now sprawled under the serving table like a contented old rug, one blue eye half open in case a biscuit fell. Sonsie sat on the sill above the hatch, tail wrapped round her paws, her wild yellow stare fixed on the door through which Blair had gone. He frightens me, Maisie said at last. He frightens everybody, said Miss Grant. That is his one reliable talent. Hamish crouched a little so he was nearer her eye level. Listen to me. Did Mr. McNab say anything when he fixed the copier? Maisie frowned through the last of her tears. Only that these old machines always betray one at the worst moment. She paused. And he said he'd finish the job. On his own? Yes, Miss Grant said slowly. That was late afternoon. I had gone to fetch flowers. Hamish nodded. There it was again, a tiny, practical corner of time in which one man had been left alone with paper, machine, and opportunity. He stood and looked out the wet hall window. Across the village green, people were moving in and out of Patel's shop with that purposeful slowness that meant they were shopping for information more than food. By evening, he knew, the story would have changed shape yet again. Maisie would be pitied by some, suspected by others, and defended by a select few who liked a cause. But one thing had shifted. The misprint had not come from the file. It had come from the jam. And the last person known to be alone with that jammed copier had been Angus McNab. Chapter 6. The Unofficial Fix. By evening, the frost had come hard at last. The rain had gone, leaving the village glazed and sharp under a pale sky. Every puddle in Lochdu had turned to glass. The loch held a dim grey light, and the hills beyond stood clear for once, cold and watchful. Smoke rose straight from the chimneys before flattening under the dark. It was the sort of evening when sound travelled far, and kindness ought to have done the same. Instead, gossip had got there first. Hamish heard it before he reached Patel's general store. Two women by the window stopped speaking when he came near. A man farther down the road took off his cap and then put it back on, as if remembering he might prefer not to be seen taking sides. Inside the shop, the queue was thicker than the shopping justified. There were too many folk buying one loaf, 1 pint of milk, and the right to linger. Mr. Patel was behind the counter. Mrs. Patel was slicing ham. Nessie and Jessie Curry were positioned by the tea tins like a pair of weathercocks for moral change. Nessie gave Hamish a look both sorrowful and excited. It is a bad business when a village girl is dragged into murder. Into murder, said Jessie. And all because grown people could not keep their papers straight. Their papers straight. Hamish set down a loaf, butter, and sausages. What village girl? Nessie drew breath with professional weight. Maisie has been sent home from choir. From choir, echoed Jessie. Miss Grant says it is only until things settle. Until things settle. But once a thing is said in public, it sticks. Hamish looked at Mr. Patel. Mr. Patel wrapped the butter. Mrs. Wellington came in for tea things. She was upset. The minister felt it would be better if the young woman stayed away for a little while, just to avoid unpleasantness. That'll do the opposite, said Hamish. Mrs. Patel slid the parcel across the counter. In a village, she said, the wish to avoid talk generally creates more of it. That was true enough to be nearly a proverb. Hamish paid and took the bag. On his way out, he heard Nessie begin again in a lowered tone that was perfectly pitched to carry. And I always say, if a girl is near a machine, there will be trouble. There will be trouble, said Jessie. Hamish kept walking. He had learned long ago that correcting the Curry sisters in full flow was like trying to fence mist. At the police station, Lugs was stretched by the stove that did at least work there, sleeping with complete faith in heat that he had not paid for. Sonsie sat on the sill, black-striped against the dark, her wild yellow eyes on the yard. Hamish put down the parcel, cut a sausage end for lugs, and looked through his notes again. Maisie had been pushed to the edge because gossip liked a frightened face. Angus MacNab had handled the jammed copier alone. Mrs. Stripe had arranged a private meeting after prayers with those concerned in the accounts, and somewhere in the kirk or the manse there ought still to be the folder marked evidence, unless Blair had already blundered over it and turned it into theatre. That thought sent Hamish back out into the cold. The manse was lit up, though not brightly. The front room curtains were drawn. A line of frost had formed along the stone edging of the path. Hamish went round by the side, meaning only to ask Mr. Wellington whether Blair had taken the folder. He had no wish to make a melodrama of paperwork. Paperwork was where motive lived, but it was also where reputations died. Mrs. Wellington answered the back door with flour on her sleeve and distress in her face. "Oh, Hamish, I was just making something for supper, though I dare say no one will eat it." "That may be wise," said Hamish kindly. "Is the minister in?" "In his study. He has had a dreadful day." "Has Blair been back?" She shuddered. "Twice?" That was enough to explain the look of the house. Mr. Wellington sat at his desk with both hands round a cup, as if it might steady him by contact alone. Papers were stacked in embarrassed little heaps. The room smelled of tea, damp wool, and old files. On the corner of the desk, half under the church accounts, lay the leather folder, evidence. Mr. Wellington saw Hamish's glance and flushed. "She left it here last night. I quite forgot. Then everything happened, and Blair has no taken it?" "Not yet." He was so busy shouting that he asked about timetables, candles, and vestry keys, but not the folder itself. Hamish stood very still. He knew what he ought to do. "Leave it there. Tell Blair. Watch the man seize it with triumph. Wave it about in Strathbane, and by morning half the Highlands would know Street. Seds had muddled money and, perhaps worse, the minister would be broken by scandal before guilt was sorted from carelessness. The church would become a joke in the papers, and if there were innocent irregularities mixed with guilty ones, Blair would flatten the difference because flattening things was what he did." Mr. Wellington looked at him miserably. "I had meant to sort the receipts properly. There was no wickedness in it on my part, only untidiness." Hamish believed him. "Untidiness, yes. Weakness, certainly. Murder, no." "I'll take that," said Hamish. Mr. Wellington blinked. "What?" "The folder. I'll log it proper later." It was not the right thing to do by police procedure. It was exactly the sort of thing Hamish did when procedure threatened to crush a whole village in order to save itself effort. He picked up the folder. At that precise moment, Mrs. Wellington, carrying a tray, stood aside to let Angela Brodie in by the back door with a covered dish in her hands. "Chicken stew," said Angela. "I thought you would all have forgotten to eat." Then she saw Hamish with the folder. Angela Brodie was too kind to leap to conclusions. That did not stop her from seeing. Hamish met her eyes. "I'm taking this in." Her expression altered only slightly, but enough. "Of course," she said. Behind her, through the half-open door, Hamish caught movement on the path. Nessie Curry, passing by for reasons known only to herself and Providence, slowed just enough to glance in. That was the moment the trouble began. Hamish knew it before the door even closed. He had not merely taken the folder, he had taken it from the manse, quietly, at night, while the village was already tense and raw. In Lochdu, that was not an action. It was a story. He left with the leather folder under his arm, and the full bad taste of a mistake already forming. The frost bit hard on the path back. The kirk stood black against the whitening ground. A weak moon showed through torn cloud. He should have gone straight to the station and entered the folder in the log. Instead, he stopped first at the church porch, when he saw Miss Grant and Mrs. Wellington together by the hall door, speaking in low, anxious voices. As he came near, they stopped. "That told him enough," Miss Grant said, not unkindly. "I've had to ask Maisie not to come to practice." Hamish felt the anger turn in him. "For what?" "For peace," said Mrs. Wellington miserably. The others were whispering. One or two mothers said they did not want their girls mixed up in things. "Mixed up in what?" asked Hamish. "Printing?" Miss Grant, who was not a fool, looked at the folder under his arm, and then back at his face. "Oh, Hamish, there was no accusation in it." "That was worse," he said, too sharply. "This has naught to do with Maisie." "It has now. said Miss Grant. "Everything does." From the road came the Curry sisters' voices floating through the cold. "I am not saying Hamish is hiding anything. Not saying. But if a man carries papers in the dark, folk will naturally wonder. Naturally wonder." Hamish shut his eyes for a second. There it was. Social harm. Neat and immediate. The wrong person isolated, the right person left with space to breathe. Back at the station, he set the folder on his desk and opened it at last. Receipts, hall bookings, repair bills, charity tallies, penciled corrections, a few pages clipped together where figures did not meet, enough to smell motive, enough to explain Lavinia Stripe's certainty, enough to damn careless men and perhaps one dishonest one. Lugs woke and put his head on Hamish's knee. "Aye," said Hamish softly. "I know." Sonsie leapt up beside the lamp and stared at the folder with fierce yellow suspicion, as if paper itself had become prey. Hamish looked from the accounts to the frost on the dark window and felt the full weight of what he had done. He had tried to spare the parish Blair's grandstanding. Instead, he had fed the village exactly the sort of secret it loved most. And somewhere out there, while Lochdu watched the wrong girl and whispered about the wrong man, the real killer was being left in peace. Chapter 7. A neat theory and a wrong corner. The next day brought a brittle, colourless noon and a wind off the loch that seemed to have sharpened itself on the hills. Frost lay white in the hollows, though the road still sweated underfoot where yesterday's damp had not quite gone. Lochdu looked washed and watchful. Folk moved through it with the awkward purpose of people who knew something had happened and wished both to discuss it and to deny enjoying the chance. Hamish had spent the morning in a round of quiet visits. He had spoken again to Mr. Wellington at the Manse, to the parish treasurer in his narrow front room above a smell of paraffin and old paper, and to Angus MacNab outside the kirk gate, where the churchwarden had smiled so steadily one might have thought him campaigning for office. By noon Hamish had facts enough to arrange, but not enough to trust. He took himself to the Red Lion for something hot and plain. The pub was dim and warm, and smelled of ale, damp coats, and soup made by a human hand. That alone was an improvement on Strathbane. Lugs came in at his heel and collapsed at once near the hearth, sprawled like an old rug with one ear folded back. Sonsie, who had no business there, was discovered some minutes later sitting on the inside sill by the frosted window, with her wild yellow eyes half shut, as if she had always belonged to licensed premises. The landlord brought Hamish thick vegetable soup, a hunk of bread, and cheese that did not come wrapped in official disappointment. Hamish ate slowly and let the warmth settle him. A neat theory had begun to form in his head, and neat theories were dangerous because they gave comfort before they gave truth. The minister had cause enough for panic. Lavinia Stripe had challenged the accounts. She had spoken of irregularities. She had demanded a private meeting. Mr. Wellington was timid, muddled, and worn thin by parish duty and his wife's earnest hospitality. It was possible to imagine him cornered in the vestry after evening prayers, faced with public disgrace and striking out in a moment of blind fear. Men had done worse things from less. The trouble was that the idea almost fitted. The minister admitted meeting Lavinia in the vestry passage for a few moments, before going back to fetch a ledger from the manse. He admitted there had been sharp words. He admitted she had accused him of laxity and weakness. He had looked miserable enough, saying it to convince any ordinary policeman. Blair had certainly been convinced. The door of the Red Lion banged open, and Blair came in as if summoned by Hamish's irritation. He carried cold air, whisky on his breath, and the usual belief that the room ought to be grateful. "There you are," he said. "Eating. It's an old Highland voice." Blair grunted and sat opposite without invitation. The bench gave a protesting creak. He looked flushed and overfed already, as if he had lunched elsewhere first and considered this a second round in honour of himself. "I've had enough," he said. "It's the minister." Hamish tore bread and said nothing. "Don't give me that fish-eyed silence." He admitted the argument. He admits the woman pressed him over accounts. He went back toward the vestry. "She winds up at the bottom of the stair. It'll do nicely." "Will it?" Blair leaned in. "You've been fretting because of that silly lass and the paper. But this is cleaner, respectable, understandable. Papers love a fallen clergyman. "Aye," said Hamish. "That's what worries me." Blair misread that as surrender and became at once more expansive. "I can have him taken in by afternoon. A strained man, parish pressure, moral woman from the city poking her nose where it wasn't wanted. There's your tragedy, there's your motive. There's my solution." Hamish put down his spoon. The theory had tempted him for an hour, and now began to repel him for the same reason. It was too complete in the wrong places. It satisfied Blair. It would end the matter quickly. It would let the village off from thinking too hard and the newspapers on to their next appetite. And it would save Maisie from another day of whispers. That, perhaps, was the worst of it. Hamish wanted it to be true because he wanted the damage to stop. The landlord passed with another basket of bread and muttered, "If it's the minister, there'll be no peace for months." "There's no peace now," said Blair. Nessie Curry, who had somehow established herself at the far end of the bar with Jessie and a cup of tea she had no intention of paying for yet, called across in a carrying whisper, "I said from the start it would be someone respectable." "Someone respectable," echoed Jessie. "It usually is. Usually is." Blair smirked, as if the Curry sisters were witness statements sent by Providence. Hamish finished his soup. It was good soup. He wished he could give it the attention it deserved. Instead, he sat staring at the table grain and trying to see the shape of the evening in the kirk. The minister argued with Lavinia. "Yes, the minister left to fetch a ledger." "Yes," Lavinia stayed to wait. "Perhaps." And in her pocket, after death, there had been that torn paper with the distinctive print, "Guide me, O thou great reorderer." Not a phrase a minister would choose for his own convenience. Blair stood up. "I'll go and have him brought in." Hamish looked up at him. "On what?" "Suspicion. You have that for half the village? I only need one." Blair swaggered off toward the door and paused there to light a cigarette outside, though the wind near took the flame from him twice. Hamish sat very still. Luggs snored once in his sleep. Sonsie opened one eye. It was the cat who made him notice it, though not by any magic. She had jumped down from the sill and was now batting idly at a scrap of paper lodged near the skirting board. The barmaid came over, embarrassed. "Sorry, Hamish. There was a batch of church notices blew in when the delivery boy opened the back door. I've been finding bits ever since." She stooped and picked it up, then held it out with a laugh. "Look, that daft misprint again." Hamish took the scrap. It was not from the ordinary hymn sheets. The paper was slightly rougher, the edge more uneven where the old copier had dragged, and the black of the letters was heavier at one side, as if the machine had been pressing crooked during the jam. A tiny thing. Less than a corner. But enough. "Where did ye get this?" he asked. "From the stack Miss Grant sent over for Sunday notices. The odd sheets were in with the rest. I used one under a dripping teapot." Hamish stood up so suddenly Luggs woke and barked once in affront. "Sunday notices, not choir practice sheets. A special little batch then, run off after the jam and mixed in later. A careless person would never have noticed the difference. A careful person might not have wanted them noticed at all." Hamish paid and left with the scrap in his hand. The wind had risen outside. It came cold off the loch, carrying the smell of water and peat smoke. Blair was still by his car, trying to look official while fighting his matchbox. "Blair." "What now?" Hamish held out the scrap. That paper in Lavinia's pocket was no from the ordinary stack. Blair scowled. "Paper is paper." "No. This is from the jam batch. Special printing done late afternoon after the copier went wrong. Heavy on one side, rough feed, different pile entirely." Blair blinked at him. Hamish went on. The pieces moving now with that unpleasant quickness they always had when the truth had been close all along. "If the minister had handed her a note from the usual church papers, any sheet would do. But this comes from the small batch handled after the jam." "The batch," Maisie said. Angus MacNab finished. "The batch no one else had reason to use." Blair's thick face darkened. "You're saying the minister didna write the note. I'm saying your tidy theories got the wrong paper." For a moment, Blair looked as if he might ignore the point out of sheer bad temper. Then even he saw it. If the note summoning Lavinia had been written on the back of one of the misprinted late-afternoon sheets, the writer had to be someone with access to that specific batch. Not the minister with his ledgers. Not chance. Someone from the copier jam. someone who had been alone with the machine. Across the road, the Curry sisters had paused in step and were watching with the unblinking delight of women who sensed a theory dying in public. Nessie called, "It is always the small detail, said Jessie. Hamish tucked the scrap into his pocket. The minister had been a plausible answer. That was what made him dangerous. A plausible answer could stop a case as neatly as a false confession. He looked toward the kirk, where the stone tower stood pale against the cold sky, and felt the whole business shift under his feet. The wrong corner of paper had just torn the wrong man out of the frame, and left Angus MacNab standing in it, almost alone. Chapter 8. Sonsie and the Wastebasket. That night, the frost bit deeper still. By the time Hamish reached his cottage, the grass outside shone white, and the path had gone hard as iron. The loch was hidden again under a low drifting mist, but he could hear the water moving in the dark. A cold wind came down from the hills and found every gap in the old place before he did. Inside, the cottage felt damp, cross, and unconvinced by human effort. The stove was still no use. Hamish lit the lamp, set the kettle on the camping burner, and stood with his hands out to a heat no stronger than bad intention. Lugs came in behind him and at once sprawled on the hearth as if the room were a palace instead of a grievance. He let out a great sigh, the sigh of a dog who believes suffering is always someone else's failure. "You're a comfort," said Hamish. Lugs thumped his tail once. "Sonsie was missing." That was not unusual. Sonsie came and went according to laws of her own, most of them feral and none of them open to appeal. Hamish cut bread, cheese, and sausage for himself, gave Lugs a piece from the end, and made tea that tasted faintly of paraffin from the burner. It was not good, but it was hot. He sat down at the table with his notes and looked again at the same hard little cluster of facts. Lavinia Stripe had arranged a private meeting after prayers. The torn paper in her pocket came from the misprinted jam batch. Angus MacNab had been alone with the copier after the jam, and Hamish, trying to protect the village from Blair, had instead fed it more talk than awake. He rubbed a hand over his face. The village did not need another loud revelation. It needed one clear one. The cat flap rattled. Sonsie came in backwards. For a moment Hamish thought she had caught some poor thing and was dragging it home in triumph. Then he saw it was paper. A crumpled sheet, greyed with dirt and damp, clenched awkwardly in her teeth. She dropped it on the floorboards, stared at him with her wild yellow eyes, and sat down beside it as if claiming salvage rights. "Well now," said Hamish. Lugs raised his head, considered whether paper was edible, and decided to wait for instructions. Hamish bent and picked the thing up carefully. It was not an ordinary notice. The paper was stiff church stock, crushed nearly flat, with one corner blackened and a faint smell clinging to it. Candle wax and toner. He smoothed it gently on the table. A draft notice, badly folded, partly smeared, but printed in the same rough, crooked way as the jam batch. There it was again in the line of type, "Guide me, O thou great reorderer." Hamish sat very still. Sonsie leapt onto the chair opposite and began washing one paw with fierce concentration, as if her duties were done. Lugs got up, came over, and rested his heavy head on Hamish's knee. "Where did she get it?" Hamish asked the dog. Lugs looked noble and empty. The answer came quickly enough. "Somewhere near the kirk. Somewhere with paper, wax, and the remains of a fire." Sonsie had never cared for office work, but she had a thief's instinct for neglected corners. Hamish stood up so fast the chair scraped. "Right." He pulled on his coat again, wrapped the crumpled sheet in clean paper from the cupboard, and took the lamp from its hook. Lugs rose at once. Sonsie slipped off the chair and reached the door first. "No," said Hamish. Neither beast paid the slightest attention. The night outside was bitter and clear in patches where the mist broke. The kirk stood dark and pale ahead of him, its windows blank, its stone rimmed with frost. His boots grated on the path. Somewhere across the water, a dog barked once and was silent. The village itself seemed tucked away indoors, but Hamish knew better than to mistake quiet for sleep. Lochdu was always listening. He let himself into street seds by the side door. The cold inside was different from the cold outside. It had no wind in it, only stillness. The air smelled of old wood stone and wax polish. His lamp cast a low yellow circle along the pews. Shadows moved behind the carved ends like figures deciding whether to step out. Lugs padded beside him, claws clicking softly. Sonsie vanished at once into the dark, as if reporting to some private post. Hamish went straight to the vestry. The little room off the stair was much as before, narrow, mean, and careful-looking in the way places often were after people had tidied them too quickly. The runner still sat square enough now, though he did not trust it. Shelves of prayer books lined one wall. A cupboard stood ajar. Near the hearth, the small iron stove used to take the edge off damp evening meetings still held a drift of ash from the previous nights. Hamish set the lamp down and crouched. There were scraps in the ash. Not many. Whoever had burned them had done it in a hurry, and not very well. He took the poker, lifted through the grey pile, and found first one curled black edge, then another. At last he saw what he was looking for. A half-burned sheet with the print still visible on the uncharred side. "Guide me, O thou great reorderer." He let out a slow breath. Thought so. The paper was fragile with heat damage, but when he turned it over and held it near the lamp, he saw faint pressure marks on the blank back. Somebody had written on the top sheet of a stack, pressing hard enough to leave an indentation through to the one beneath. Hamish fetched a pencil from his pocket and shaded lightly across the back. Letters began to rise. Vestry. After prayers. Call me alone. It was all there. No flourish, no signature, just a summons. Enough to bring Lavinia Stripe where she could be met unwitnessed and hurried onto the stair. Lugs, bored by paper but loyal to the process, lay down across the doorway like an old hearthrug and nearly blocked the light. Hamish had to step over him to get a better angle. Behind the hymn book shelf came a faint rustle, and Sonsie's eyes flashed once in the dark before disappearing again. Hamish looked from the half-burned sheet to the crumpled one she had brought home. The same batch, the same faulty printing, the same wax smell from this room. Someone had tried to clear it away after the death. Burn the misprinted sheets, destroy the evidence, leave the village to blame nerves, piety, or the wrong girl. He straightened slowly, the cold in the vestry now seeming cleaner than the thoughts behind it. There had been no accident. There had not even been much planning. Only a quick trap laid by a man who believed paper could be tidied and fear would do the rest. Hamish tucked the burned fragment into an envelope from his pocket and folded the shaded sheet inside his notebook. Then he stood for a moment in the silence of the little room, listening to the kirk settle round him, far off. Wind pressed lightly against the windows. The place felt not haunted, exactly, but watchful. The next step was plain. He could not chase Angus over the moors or wait for another scrap to fall out of a wastebasket. This was Lochdu. The truth had been made here, in public faces and private pride. It would have to be brought out the same way. Not with Blair shouting, with witnesses, with tea, chairs, and nowhere polite to hide. Hamish lifted the lamp and looked down at Lugs. "Up, you great article." Lugs groaned, rose, and stretched. From the darkness behind the hymn books, Sonsie came out soundlessly, her tail high, as if satisfied with the evening's work. By the time Hamish locked the kirk behind him, he knew what he would do next. He would gather them all after Sunday service, and let one crooked word do the accusing. Chapter 9. The Choir Tea Trap. Sunday came with a hard white frost, and a sky so clear above the hills that the cold seemed to ring in it. The loch lay dark and still under the morning light, with only a thin breath of mist trailing low over the water. Lochdu looked neat, watchful, and overdressed for trouble. Folk went to kirk in their best coats and boots, carrying prayer books, opinions, and a lively interest in who would sit beside whom. Hamish stood for a moment outside Streetseds and watched them arrive. The curry sisters were first, or near enough. Nessie advanced with the solemn energy of a woman attending both worship and theatre. Jessie came at her shoulder, as faithful as an echo. "I am saying nothing today," Nessie announced to Mrs. Patel, who had not asked. "Nothing today," said Jessie. "Because in the house of God, one should be restrained." Restrained. Mrs. Patel inclined her head with admirable calm. "That will be a novelty." Hamish nearly smiled. Inside, the kirk was full of the small sounds of Highland order. The clearing of throats, pages turning, the scrape of shoes on stone, the cough of a child being told to behave. The minister looked pale but composed. Mrs. Wellington had the determined expression of a woman who means to get through a public ordeal on tea and dignity alone. Miss Grant kept the choir in line with a look sharp enough to cut slate. Maisie sat near the back. Not with the singers, but under Miss Grant's eye. Her face was strained. Angus MacNab stood 2 pews forward, neat as ever, his dark coat well brushed, his manner modest and useful. Too useful, thought Hamish. Lugs had wedged himself under a side pew and gone to sleep at once, sprawled like an old hearthrug in borrowed holiness. Sonsie had not come in through the door with anyone, but Hamish had already seen the flick of her striped tail vanish behind the hymn-book shelf. There was no keeping her out of a mystery once she had chosen her side. The service passed without visible disaster. Hamish heard almost none of the sermon. He watched faces instead. Angus sang the hymns in a correct, controlled voice, not warmly but competently. Mr. Wellington stumbled only once over a prayer. Maisie kept her eyes lowered. And when the final hymn began, Hamish saw 3 or 4 villagers glance down at the printed line with the same small, involuntary movement. "Guide me, O thou great reorderer." The misprint was still there in some of the sheets. He had made sure of it. After the benediction, the congregation began to flow toward the parish hall for tea and biscuits. That was Lochdu's habit after any service of consequence. Today the habit suited Hamish very well. The hall filled quickly. Cups clinked, chairs scraped, steam rose from the urn. The room smelled of wet wool, strong tea, and Miss Grant's disapproval of shop-bought shortbread. Hamish moved among them with his usual loose, mild air, thanking Mrs. Wellington for the tea, asking Archie McLean after his boat, remarking to Mr. Patel that the frost might at least keep the road firm. All the while he was arranging the room without seeming to do so. He wanted the minister, Angus MacNab, the treasurer, Miss Grant, Maisie, Mrs. Wellington, the Patels, the Kari sisters, and enough villagers to make courtesy impossible and denial uncomfortable. Blair arrived halfway through the second pouring of tea. He came in red-faced from the cold, trailing cigarette smoke and official offence. A young Strathbane constable followed with a notebook. Blair looked round the room with immediate dislike, as if civility itself were a personal insult. "What's all this?" he demanded. "Tea," said Hamish. "You may have missed the scent." Blair ignored him. "I'm taking proper statements." Nessie Curry drew herself up. "In a parish hall?" "In a parish hall," said Jessie. "On the Sabbath?" "On the Sabbath." "Take a biscuit, Blair," said Hamish. "It may improve ye." Blair snorted and pushed past him. His eyes fell at once on Maisie. "There's the girl." Maisie went white. Hamish stepped lightly across his path. "She's staying where she is." Blair's face swelled with temper. "You don't give me orders, Macbeth." "No," said Hamish mildly. "I save them up for special occasions." The room had gone quiet now. Even cups were being set down more softly. Hamish turned to the gathering. "I asked ye all to stay for a few minutes because this business has gone on long enough. Lochdu's been tearing itself apart over whispers, and I'd rather finish it before ye do more harm than the killer did." Mrs. Wellington gave a small gasp. Angus MacNab smiled faintly, but Hamish saw the line of strain at the corner of his mouth. Blair barked. "If there's to be any accusation made, I'll make it." "Aye," said Hamish. "That's what worried me." There was a thin little laugh from somewhere near the hatch. Even Blair heard it. Hamish let his eyes move round the room. He kept his voice soft and conversational, almost lazy. "Mrs. Stripe came to Lochdu to improve folk. That wasna a gift to win affection. But she was no killed for being tiresome. She was killed because she found something out." The treasurer shifted in his chair. Mr. Wellington stared at his cup. "The accounts were untidy," Hamish went on. "Some of that was weakness. Some of it was laziness. But only one part of it was theft." "At that," Angus MacNab said pleasantly, "this is a serious charge to make in a hall full of people." "It is," said Hamish. "That's why I brought the people." Blair folded his arms. "Get on with it, then." Hamish took from his pocket the half-burned sheet in its envelope and the crumpled draft notice Sonsie had dragged home. He laid both on the table beside the tea-urn, as if setting down raffle prizes. "A hymn sheet misprint seems a small thing," he said. It gave folk a laugh. Great Redeemer became Great Reorderer. But the mistake wasn't a general. It came from one specific copier jam. A small batch was printed after the machine chewed the page. Maisie printed the ordinary stack. Then the copier jammed. Mr. Macnab offered to help. All eyes turned to Angus. He gave a short laugh. I was trying to be useful. That is hardly a crime. No, said Hamish. But finishing the special batch yourself gave ye access to paper nobody else had reason to use. Miss Grant spoke up at once. That is true. I had gone for flowers. Maisie, hands shaking round her teacup, said, And I fetched paper. He told me he'd sort it. Hamish nodded. The torn paper in Mrs. Stripe's pocket came from that jam batch, not from the ordinary hymn sheets. The print was heavier on one side. Rough feed. Same on this draft notice. Same on this half-burned sheet I found in the vestry stove. A murmur went through the room. Mrs. Patel put down the sugar tongs with great care. Blair frowned. Burned sheet? Hamish ignored him. On the back of that sheet was an indentation, a note written on the page above it. He unfolded the paper and read, Vestry. After prayers. Come alone. No one spoke. Hamish looked at Angus. That note lured Mrs. Stripe to the stair. Angus's smile did not hold now. This is absurd. Anyone could have written it. Anyone with access to that special paper? Asked Hamish. No. No the minister, who was using the regular stack. No Maisie, whose file had no misprint. No Mrs. Wellington. No the treasurer. Only the man who took over the copier after the jam. The room seemed to tighten round Angus Macnab. Blair took a step forward. And you say that's enough? It's no all, said Hamish. His voice changed then, just a little. The soft Highland lilt sharpened, the sibilants showing through like sleet over stone. Mrs. Stripe found the figures didn't match. Hall repairs charged twice, charity money diverted. Small sums, carefully moved. She threatened exposure. You met her after prayers, in the vestry, thinking you could frighten her into silence. She wouldn't be frightened. So you shoved her on the stair, then you tugged the runner straight and burned what paper you could. Mrs. Wellington put a hand to her mouth. Mr. Wellington closed his eyes. Angus said, You can prove none of that. But the words came too fast, and there was sweat now at his temple despite the cold hall. Hamish did not move. You were too careful in all the wrong places, too neat, too ready with the smile, and you made one mistake no thief should make in Lochdu. You assumed paper mattered more than people watching. Nessie Curry spoke before she could stop herself. He did smile far too much, said Jessie. That broke something. Angus turned toward the door as if he might push through, but Blair and the Strathbane constable were there already. He stopped, looked round the ring of familiar faces, and whatever calculation had held him up till then gave way. She had no right, he said hoarsely. Do you hear me? No right. Coming in from the city, speaking as if we were all dirty children. She said she would ruin me, over sums that would have been put right. Would they? Asked Hamish. Angus laughed once. A miserable dry sound. I only wanted time. She wouldn't give it. She stood there on the stair above me, talking down as if I were filth. He swallowed. I caught her arm. She pulled back. Then I pushed. Maisie began to cry quietly. Miss Grant put an arm round her shoulders at once. Blair stepped in with great official force now that the work was done. Angus Macnab, I arrest you. But no one was looking at Blair. They were looking at Angus. At the churchwarden they had known by his tidy coat and his ready keyring. At the one who had stood in meetings and passed collection plates and spoken about repairs as if thrift were a virtue. Hamish looked down at the misprinted sheet on the table. One crooked word. That was all it had taken to keep the truth from being tidied away. Chapter 10. Warmth returns, slowly. By Monday morning the frost had begun to ease. The hard white edge on the fields had gone watery, and a thin thaw ran down the road in shining tracks. Mist drifted over the loch in pale strips. Lochdu looked tired, as villages do after scandal, when everybody has been too interested for too long and must now pretend to be merely shocked. At the police station, Blair was already taking credit. He stood in the office with the Strathbane constable beside him, a cup of tea in one hand and self-importance in the other. His face was flushed with victory and poor sleep. "I knew it from the start," he announced. "Churchwarden type. Always the dangerous ones. Quiet theft, then panic. I pressed him and he broke." Hamish, who had been writing up his notes with care, did not look up. "Ah, yeah." Blair glared at him. "You might sound a little less doubtful when addressing your superior." "I'm saving my enthusiasm," Blair sniffed. "The report goes in under my name. Naturally. You may append your local observations." Such generosity. Blair missed the edge in that, or heard it, and chose to think himself above it. He pulled on his gloves with much unnecessary tugging. "And don't think," he said, "that your little business with the folder is forgotten. Inverness will hear of your obstruction." He paused, waiting for alarm. Hamish dipped his pen in ink. "That'll brighten their day." Blair gave him one last thick, sour look and went out, leaving behind the smell of damp wool and triumph borrowed from other people's work. When the door shut, Lugs, who had been sprawled by the chair like an old hearthrug, opened one blue eye and sneezed. Sonsie, on the window-sill, watched the yard with fierce yellow contempt. "Aye," said Hamish. "That was about the size of it." He finished the report properly. Angus MacNab had confessed in front of witnesses. The misprinted sheets tied the meeting note to the jam batch. The accounts showed enough shifting of money to support motive. It was all tidy now on paper, though not nearly so tidy in people. That was the trouble with a village case. The arrest ended the legal part. It did not repair the social one. By 10 o'clock Hamish had gone first to the manse. Mr. Wellington looked older than he had a week earlier. Relief had not improved him. It had only taken away the prop of uncertainty and left him to face his own weakness in daylight. Mrs. Wellington showed him into the kitchen, where the kettle was boiling and the table was laid with toast nobody had yet touched. "I scarcely know how to look anyone in the face," said Mr. Wellington, taking off his spectacles and polishing them, only to put them back on at once. "I should have kept the accounts better. I should have seen what was happening. I should have—" "You should stop saying should for a minute," said Hamish. "It's no helping." Mrs. Wellington gave him tea. It was strong and sensible. There was marmalade on the table, and a loaf still warm from Tommel Castle Hotel. Priscilla, thought Hamish, had likely understood before anyone asked that the manse would forget food in the middle of disgrace. "We'll set it right," said Hamish. 2 signatures for hall repairs. Proper recording for collections. No more papers shoved into drawers because folk are tired. Mr. Wellington looked miserable. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple. Folk make it difficult, because they dislike being ashamed," Mrs. Wellington said softly. "And Maisie?" "That's the next thing." He found Maisie not at the hall, but in Patel's general store, where she was standing by the shelves with a basket in her hands and the look of someone who half expected the room to shift away from her. The queue was long. That was useful. So were the Curry sisters, who were already in place by the biscuit tins. Nessie turned at once. "We are all thankful the truth has come out." "The truth has come out," said Jessie. "Though a stain can linger. A stain can linger." Hamish set down bacon, bread, tea, and a packet of sausages. "Not in this case." The shop quietened. Mr. Patel kept slicing ham, but Hamish saw the quick gleam of interest in his eye. Mrs. Patel folded her hands and waited. Hamish said clearly, "Maisie did nothing wrong. She printed the ordinary sheets. Angus MacNab took over when the copier jammed. The note to Mrs. Stripe came from his batch, no hers. Anyone saying different is talking nonsense." Nessie drew breath. "Well, I never said." "Never said," echoed Jessie. "You implied," said Hamish. There was a small pause. Then Mrs. Patel said, in her calm, warm voice, "That should settle matters." "It will," said Mr. Patel. In Lochdu, that was as close to an official bulletin as mattered. By the time Hamish left the shop, the correction was already travelling out behind him, carried on the same channels that had done the damage. The village could be cruel, but it could also be efficient when given better material. Miss Grant met him on the church path later and gave a sharp nod. Maisie is back with the choir on Wednesday. Good. She sings flat when upset. Many do. Miss Grant almost smiled. And thank you. He shrugged and walked on. From there he went to the Brodys' house, where Angela had insisted on feeding him, and Dr. Brodie had insisted on pretending this was not fuss. Their kitchen was as cluttered as ever, and Angela's attempt at buns had come out heavy enough to discourage theft. But the soup was good, and the room was warm. Dr. Brodie stirred his coffee. So Blair has the credit. Ah, yeah. And you have the work? Ah, yeah. Angela set down a plate with one alarming bun and some butter. It is outrageous. Have another bowl of soup. That's the kindest threat I've had all day. She smiled dreamily. I do what I can, Dr. Brodie said. The village will recover. It usually does. Will you? Hamish looked into the soup for a moment before answering. I prefer things quiet. Dr. Brodie gave a dry snort. Then you have chosen in the wrong profession and the right village. That was true enough. By late afternoon the thaw had gone farther. Water dripped from eaves. The loch lay dark and almost calm, only the edges ruffled by wind. Hamish went back to his cottage with a parcel of food from Angela, a smaller parcel from the Patels, and the sensation that Lochdu had turned one page but not yet settled flat. His stove was still broken. He stood over it in disgust, while Lugs wagged hopefully at the smell of food, and Sonsie inspected the parcel string with predatory interest. There came a knock at the door. It was Archie McLean, cap in hand, his small, weathered face turned shy under its usual gruffness. Heard your stove's still dead. News travels. Aye. Thought I'd have a look. No point in a policeman freezing if there's work to be had from him. That sounds almost generous. It's no. Archie bent at once to the stove. Hand us that wrench. Between them, and mostly because Archie knew the habits of old metal and bad fittings, they got the thing going again by dusk. It gave one sulky cough, then a proper breath of heat. Warmth began to creep back into the room in cautious layers. There, said Archie. It'll hold till spring, likely. What do I owe ye? Archie looked offended. You can stop asking daft questions. Maybe send Lugs away from my haddock smokehouse if he's passing. I'll negotiate with him. Archie grunted and went off into the evening before thanks could become awkward. Hamish shut the door and stood by the stove for a moment. Lugs flung himself down before it at once, a dog taking credit for engineering by proximity alone. Sonsie jumped to the chair nearest the heat and sat with her paws tucked under, her wild yellow eyes half shut in hard-won approval. Hamish made tea, proper tea now, with a proper flame under the kettle. He cut bread, cheese, and sausage. He gave the first bit to Lugs, who accepted it as tribute, and the second to Sonsie, who accepted it as her due. Outside, the last of the light faded over the loch. Somewhere, far off, a gull cried and was still. The village would keep talking for days. Blair would boast for weeks. Inverness might yet decide Hamish Macbeth deserved promotion, which to him remained a kind of exile. The minister would have to live with his carelessness. Maisie would sing again, and Street. Sed's, after all its fuss and frost and paper, would go on opening its doors each Sunday as if nothing had happened and everything had. Hamish sat down by the restored heat and let the quiet gather. He had no taste for triumph. What pleased him, if anything did, was smaller than that. The wrong girl had been cleared. The dead woman had not been dismissed as a nuisance who slipped. And Lochdu, which had judged too quickly, was already beginning the old village work of putting itself back together without admitting it had come apart. Lugs put his head on Hamish's knee. Aye, said Hamish softly. We're home. Lochdu will keep singing. But it will sing a touch more carefully for a while, because judgment arrived with a folder and death followed close behind. In a small place, tragedy does not vanish. It gets worked into daily life, like a crease left in a hymn book after too many hands have held it. That misprinted hymn sheet looked harmless at first. One crooked word, one laugh in a cold kirk. But it became the thing no one could smooth away. The smallest flaw on the page turned out to be the mark of the biggest lie. There is a difference between conscience and control. The people who speak most loudly about order are not always trying to make life better. Sometimes they are only trying to arrange the room in their own favour, And sometimes the ones who fear exposure most are the ones already reaching for respectability as cover. Still, the kettle boils. The stove catches. The dog settles. The cat gives in to warmth without ever admitting it. And outside, beyond all the whispering and sharp elbows, the loch lies quiet again. Which do you think causes more harm in a close-knit place? Bad intentions or good intentions delivered with sharp elbows? Thank you for spending part of your evening with me. Leave your thoughts in the comments and tell me whether you would have trusted that first neat explanation or waited for the crooked word. Until the next strange little trouble finds Lochdu, good night from Highland Mystery.